Hi there. I started to do these podcasts on the advice of a few friends who had heard my story about surviving schizophrenia and mental illness and thought I'd share it here. I'm not sure how many people are going to watch this, and I hope actually that my mom does. So there's one. Anyway, I'll put this online and I'll try not to do too many cuts in here. Just try to read through. I do have some notes, things that I'd like to talk about, and I can answer any questions anyone has. I'll do some readings from my book, and I think I'll start off with one of those. This is from the prologue. I was scared walking through the greenhouses and foaming at the mouth. I looked at a power panel, thinking it had flames billowing out of it. The plants were giving off an odd, deep smell, and everything looked and felt very otherworldly, dark, and scary. When my dad saw me, he thought he should take me to the hospital, and I agreed to go. It was the hospital I was born in and had been admitted twice as a child with croup, this time seeing a psychiatrist who asked a bunch of questions that I was too afraid to answer. I tried to leave the room to get away, but Dad stood in my way at the door, blocking me. As I tried to get by him, he grabbed me by my long hair, leaving him with a handful. I frantically broke away, the psychiatrist yelling, "No, no, let him leave." I went outside and started to wander around, not knowing what to do, feeling like I was someone else, not the musician I had been for years. That all seemed so far away now. The general hospital called the police, who arrived in minutes and took me to the psychiatric hospital, but I didn't recognize the building, thinking that I had gone to another dimension and was no longer in this world. This first hospital admission was 1 out of 9. I was put on meds in the hospital for several weeks and was released to my parents, staying at their home. This admission was the easy one. So a little bit of background on the prologue leading up to that first admission in hospital. I had for years been involved in music and drumming, and it was really my life passion, and I had been doing it for a number of years part-time. When I was a kid, about 12 years old, with a public school band, played during the weekends at different community centers. So music was a part of my life. I was in a militia band. So I ended up in Toronto, which is in the story as well. I ended up in Toronto and playing music for 12 years as a full-time musician. And around that time, I started to fast and not look after myself, and I was on a spiritual journey, and the fasting seemed to trigger something in me, and I don't know exactly what happened, but I started to smell and have smell and taste hallucinations, and stopped eating, started wandering the streets of Toronto. I ended up on the streets, as I'll read from that a little bit later, from the section about a complete mental breakdown. I ended up on the streets, and I started wandering the streets and basically homeless for a little while. Went back to Thunder Bay and really was totally, my life was way out of control. So I ended up in hospital 9 times and 9 admissions in total. And it was a hard go because a lot of bad things happened in the hospital, which I also talk about. But, I got through all that and ended up a better person for it, I think. And I spent a lot of time working on myself. After I got out of the hospital, I'd lost all my social skills. I no longer could relate in a public kind of atmosphere with people. So it took me basically a long time after going back to Thunder Bay that I was actually well enough to start working again. I did do that. I started DJing. I started playing music again a little bit with a band. I was teaching drums to some students, ended up with 40 students a week. So that in itself was a little bit of a success story for me, just getting out of that, out of that hole I was in, that mental illness put me into. So anyway, it took me 19 years, but I made my way back to Toronto eventually after that time, and realized that I could move back to the city, and I came back here in 2007, and I first thought maybe I could teach drums again because I was doing that in Thunder Bay, or I could karaoke DJ, which I was also doing there. None of those panned out. The drumming didn't work out because they wanted somebody with a BA or a master's in music, and for the most part to teach in the city. The karaoke, there was only really stuff that needed a car at the time, so that didn't pan out. So I ended up doing background in film and TV just as an extra. I did that for 7 years, where I met Elaine, who was my partner. I met her on background. We were just friends for about a year, and then we started dating and became partners about a year or so after we met. And then I started doing plant maintenance a little bit. I was looking after tropical plants after the background kind of dried up for me because of my age. And I got a little bit older. I was not getting the parts anymore for background parts for like doctor, lawyer, teacher, cop, all that kind of stuff. Doctor, I used to get those parts as well. So I thought, well, what am I going to do now? So I started doing plant maintenance, looking after tropical plants. And I did that for about 5 years. And then during COVID, the whole bottom kind of dropped out of that because a lot of the places we couldn't get into anymore. And when that happened, most of the plants died. And I was out of work for a little while. So thought, well, what am I going to do next? I applied for some other jobs. I did have some help during COVID financially a little bit. And then I thought, I'll look on some online stores and online areas and see what I could find for work. And I saw a Major League Baseball team in Toronto was looking for help. So first I applied for 50/50, selling 50/50 tickets. And I didn't hear back about that. So I applied for retail sales associate. I thought, maybe I could do that. I had done a little bit of sales in my past. So I sent that in, and I ended up getting the job after a little bit of looking for other jobs and getting turned down. And I got the job, and I've been working there for a couple of years. And for a person with schizophrenia, that was a big deal for me because they didn't know I had schizophrenia when they hired me. So they hired me just based on my interview, which at first didn't go well, but I basically said the interview didn't go well. I apologize. I hope you see my strengths. I sent them an email stating that. And like a half hour after I did that, I had gotten the job. So it's all been pretty good after that. And I think I'll do some more reading of the breakdown part of my illness. And we'll start from there. Thank you. So this is a reading from the section, A Complete Mental Breakdown, and it starts in 1988. Just before my breakdown, I was living at a house with Tina and Burke. Tina was a woman I met a few years earlier at the By the Way Cafe, a favorite spot of mine, and we dated briefly, later becoming good friends. While at the house, my last full-time job was looking after tropical plants in office towers in Toronto. I was getting more and more undependable, not showing up for all my contracted offices, instead going to a park during the day, listening to live bands that were playing. Finally, I just up and quit. This was the time of my spiritual journey, during which I read a lot of books about spirituality. I remember feeling so great and alive that at one point when I was living with Tina and Burke, I was dancing by myself in our living room to music, and everything felt so free. From my spiritual book readings, I figured that it might be a good idea to start fasting for a couple of weeks. I was drinking and eating very little. I thought I was having a serious religious experience. During my fasting, I took on a job as a waiter at the By the Way Cafe. At this point, I had already stopped eating for about a week and was not shaving anymore. Just a little background about that. I had been on a spiritual journey, I would say all my life. I'd always been interested in spirituality. But around this time, it all came to a head. I started fasting, as I was saying, and not eating. And it started a whole series of events that really spiraled very, very quickly. Within several weeks, I started to spiral down. So back to the story. On my very first day of working there at the By the Way Cafe, I was very paranoid, feeling consumed with fear that my life was in danger and was out of control. I was sure in my mind that there was some great conspiracy and that I could be murdered at any time. The owner of the restaurant asked me to go downstairs to pick up some falafel mix from a Tupperware bin that was in a room. Once downstairs, I saw a sign on the bin's lid that said, "Keep closed." Confused, I thought there was no way I was going to open that with the sign telling me not to. This shows me how my breakdown was skewing my thinking process. I went back upstairs and told the owner that the sign said, "Keep closed." And he just kind of gave me a look and shrugged and didn't say too much. But at the end of the day, he told me it wasn't going to work out, kindly paid me for the day, and I left. I started walking on the streets in bare feet for several weeks, stepping on broken glass and stones on purpose, thinking it was a very spiritual thing to do. I needed to feel pain. I developed major calluses on the bottoms of my feet, and I walked to the Eaton Center downtown, noticing that many people in the area were wearing sunglasses. I thought they were angels, and that the sunglasses were to hide their pure-looking eyes, keeping their identity secret. I stood in front and started to speak loudly to anyone passing by that would listen, saying, "The Roman Catholic Church controls billions of dollars of assets while many people in the world are starving." And I would be shouting that out, basically, over and over again, and basically drew a crowd for a little bit. An old man sitting on a bench, whom I thought was the devil, stood up and came up to me and yelled, "I'm Roman Catholic. What are you saying about the church?" I kept talking and repeating what I was saying, to which he said, "You're flogging a dead horse. Stop it." And he started pushing me around. At that point, I remembered something from the Bible telling me about telling the devil to get behind you. So I said, "Get behind me, Satan." And the man did, pushing me to the ground several times, telling me to stop what I was saying. Like I said, there was a crowd gathered at that time. So a young man who had sunglasses on, who had sunglasses I also thought was an angel, was very kind, and he got between the two of us. He stopped the old man, who had what appeared to be dirty magazines stuck in front of his pants, from pushing me around, telling me to leave me alone, and pulled his pants up. I asked the kind man if I could see his eyes, and he lifted the sunglasses. I cried, thinking that I had just seen an angel's eyes. And I said to him, "They're beautiful." He just smiled. After a few more minutes, I stopped my preaching. The old man left, and so did I, walking several miles uptown to a movie theater where I'd heard on the news The Last Temptation of Christ, a very controversial movie, was playing. When I arrived in front of the theater, an older priest was leading his congregation around in circles in support of their Savior by protesting the movie. I'm sure they were thinking they were doing a good thing, but I started spouting off about the church again, yelling things like, "Oh, hypocrites," and things like that. A young woman who was with the congregation said to me, "Leave them alone, they're old people." So at this point, I felt terrible, to be honest. I thought, oh, these poor people, like here I am, spouting this stuff up. And she was right, they were old people, and I felt bad that I actually made them feel bad. So I felt really bad, so I left and I went to a nearby street corner, continued to speak my piece, when another young woman, hearing me, came by and handed me a bouquet of beautiful flowers. That random act of kindness touched me so deeply. I'll go on a little bit more. I'll read a few more sections, and then I'll probably end this first podcast, and then just leave everything open to questions. Or then in future podcasts, I'll post more from the book, and see how it goes. So the next little part here. My mind was not focused and was all over the place, and was fear with conflicting ideas. I decided I should walk across the United States barefoot for charity. That night, I went to a Toronto bus station, randomly choosing to get a ticket for a bus leaving for Cincinnati, Ohio. And I have no idea how I chose Cincinnati of all places. I guess I just saw it on the board, and I thought, yeah, Cincinnati, I think that sounds like a good place. So I decided to go to Cincinnati, and the bus was leaving in the next hour, which sounded perfect to me. I bought a one-way ticket, which I didn't realize I needed to return one. Once we got to the border, they had us all get out of the bus. The U.S. border officer asked me a bunch of questions and looked through my bag, which only had a Bible, a few pair of socks, and a few other light clothes. He was not impressed, telling me basically he wasn't going to let me into the U.S. So I had to wait a few hours for a return bus to Toronto, and once arriving, went back home to the house where I lived with Tina and Burke. One other little continuing section from that I wanted to add. So after I went back home to the house with Tina and Burke, undaunted, the next day I took a day bus to the border again, but this time trying to get across to Buffalo, New York. I got a return ticket and arrived several hours later. We all got off the bus, and the border officer could see on his computer that I had been turned away to go to Cincinnati the night before. I got in a huge argument with him, and I said the U.S. needs us more than we need them. He didn't like that comment and asked what they needed Canada for. I continued to shoot off my big mouth and said, for drinking water once yours is all polluted. He was infuriated, and with that comment took me outside, where he threatened me, saying, if you ever come back to this border again, you'll leave in an ambulance. I returned to Toronto and the house once again. So basically, I can do excerpts from different parts of the book, and maybe there'll be some discussion about the different sections. I can talk more about my childhood. I basically just jumped in right to where my illness started, and there's a lot more that happened with that, of course, with the hospital admissions and that type of thing. So I'll try and just read different sections. Maybe if somebody wants to post what kind of stuff they would like to hear about, or any kind of questions for this podcast, that would be very much appreciated. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoyed what you heard so far. And I hope that some of you felt that I'm taking you on a journey that you're interested in, and I hope it continues on. I'll post a few more of these and see how it goes. Thanks very much.